Matt Davis character over.
We'll try this again. All right, it's the little red button.
Let's have the unruly members of the audience ejected.
That's right. We'll start this over. It's 5:35. It's time to begin our August 10th meeting of the Provo City Planning Commission for today. Before we begin, we will begin with a word of prayer by Mr. Jones, and following Mr. Jones, Ms. Jensen will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Jones.
Our Father in heaven, we pray unto thee at the beginning of this Planning Commission meeting. We ask for thy spirit and thy guidance to be with us. We pray for wisdom and good judgment. We thank thee for the land in which we live, for the freedoms we enjoy. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Stand. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much, Mr. Jones and Ms. Jensen. We'll begin with a roll call, starting this time to shake things up on my right-hand side. Please state your name and whether you have any conflicts of interest for any of the items on our agenda tonight.
Deborah Jensen, no conflicts.
Ross Flum, no conflicts.
Edward Jones, no conflicts.
Brian Smith, no conflicts.
Thank you very much. We have one item for a public hearing and then one item of administration towards the end. Because this first item has a star, it will require legislative action by the municipal council. However, it is worth noting on this one item that staff is recommending just to provide input or information for us tonight. As such, we won't be making a recommendation to the municipal council on this first item. And the first item, item number 1, Provo City Community Development Department requests a zoning ordinance amendment to section 14.14D.030 and section 14.14E.030 relating to minimum lot area required for projects in the campus high-density residential and the campus mixed-use zones. And this will, of course, have citywide impact. And we will turn the time over to hear from city staff, specifically Mr. Maxfield. Mr. Maxfield.
Good there, thank you. Even though this is citywide because of that, the only two existing zones are actually in Joaquin. There are possibilities that could extend further to the west at some point in the future, but right now it deals with the Joaquin neighborhood. And if you recall, the Joaquin neighborhood plan was adopted probably, even 3 years ago now. It's our oldest adopted plan, neighborhood plan that we have. And in that plan, it established these higher density zones next to the campus area. We do have one large apartment complex that's under construction now there on 9th East that's within that zone. And so it is a lot higher density than we've had otherwise. As we've looked at areas, and we've got a number that we're going to go through tonight, and well, not tons, but at least some to give you some idea of what we're talking about. We notice there are certain situations where the blocks are broken up by existing apartment buildings. It only leaves a certain amount that can still be developed. The original intent of these zones was that you would accumulate property so you could do larger scale projects rather than a lot of piecemeal, long, elongated projects, which I think was, everybody felt was kind of the bane of the area, that you just had these long, skinny ones with barely a door out front and they extended through the block instead of something that really offered a look and feel of as a community in a sense. So we went around and as we started preparing this ordinance, we know there were a couple of things. You have to have the 40,000 square feet to get the max density, which is 80 units an acre. Otherwise, it's if you've got 20, you're down to half density on the project. And one of the issues became, does that really get us what we want? You know, that's an incentive to assemble land, but at the same time, then you kind of come up with a structure that maybe doesn't have the bulk or the mass that you wanted as an infill project because they can't get the density. I think the key is always, and this will always be the case in a lot of these, but parking is still the number one thing that determines a lot of the density. But I think what we want to talk tonight was some of this building mass and the best way to maybe approach these areas. And what I'll do is walk you through certain blocks and show you some of the developments that kind of come into play. The first one's the block that's bounded by 700 North on the south side, 800 North on the north side, and then University Avenue and First East. The home on the corner that you probably all see, the Casa de Hombres, I think is the name of it. It's Spanish style, but it's really isolated from the rest of the development. You have a one-story building here, and it barely shows up on this corner, kind of in this area, if you can see that. That's the one that's here on the north. And then the white building is right here. This is part of the Elms apartment complex. I know these are Elms. I think that one may be too, but the apartment complex you can see goes right to this corner right next to it. So that gives you an example of an isolated corner that's surrounded by other areas. Now, conceivably, they could pick up some in the parking areas, do structure, do some other things that might incorporate this site and do something. However, some of the concern is if somebody came with this project, would it be, well, could you even do anything in this situation? Maybe I'll give you a better example on another one. This lot right next door is part of the complex, and you can barely see it here. It's an older home that's between there. If they came in to redevelop it, this is a case where you can probably incorporate it into the current project. And this is part of the project, that would kind of be the way that would go. But the examples we're trying to give you are the whole range too. So this is going to skip around a little bit. I apologize for that. But in some cases you say, well, here's kind of a solution. Other ones you say, well, that's maybe a stronger situation. Okay, the ones on the right are the northern part of the block where you have the home on the corner. I don't know if you can get details on that. But then this again is the Elms apartments that are in this area. And then you've got these little homes on the corner. This one at least, it's a two-story frame with, what do we call those things? English frame or? Tudor. Are they pure Tudor? Okay. Which actually fits a little bit with Knight Mangum Hall. That's this large structure here. It's an old dormitory is used for offices now. And so there is some style there that ties in, but again, these are privately owned. They're not owned by the university. And so, somebody got these two lots together, what would you want on this corner? The size of those two lots would reduce it to 20 units per acre, where on this intersection where you've got the small commercial area over here, and where we've looked for some commercial, would you be able to get the density to really make the door costs function on this? And so, that's the situation. This area is still probably looking at, what it would take to even have a reasonable development or redevelopment of some of these areas. And that one's a little bit more style into the neighborhood. Some other ones aren't as much. Okay, this one's up on 9th East here on the north side, or I'm sorry, on the right side or the east side. And then 600, it's 650, or I can't remember the exact street is, but this is 700 on the north. So this complex goes and wraps around it. You can see the size of that. This development was not included. This developer actually built his parking structure that opens toward this property so that if he ever acquired it, he could incorporate that into the project. However, there's no guarantee that would happen. If this came in individually to develop, that would, be the question, how would you do that and how do you make it fit into the nature of the area? But you can see a large density off of this project from some of these others. It doesn't always show up in the overhead photos. Okay, in this block, this is 400 east on the right, 300 east on the left, 800 north on the top, and 700 north on the bottom. On the east facing of this block, you have a couple situations. You used to have two single-family homes here. This Monticello apartments come down, have a parking structure through this area. This corner was built out, and you can kind of get some of the side, but it's a fairly new development, relatively new. But it's left this home there by itself. And so the question would be, okay, what would be reasonable to fit in between, the Monticello apartments and this other structure? Monticello apartments have the mansard roof. You can see there's an age to it, but it's not so old that I think the value is down, that somebody feel there'd be a reason to tear that down and rebuild. However, as you go further east along this street, you can see the next home, I think it's called Y Manor. This houses a number of male students in there. And then looking to the right, you have what's referred to as the red brick, their townhome or row house that go along this edge. And they have doors on both sides. But this is one of the oldest structures down through these areas. These are probably a 1930, 40 type age in there. I'm not quite sure, but and you can kind of see a little bit, well, I apologize for this. We'll make you drive by during the week. You can see in more detail. But this is a situation that if you did take the home and take these other units out, you would have 40,000 square feet, through this area. So it's a possibility that somebody could come in and redo this. At the same time, like for the red brick ones here, they have a certain flavor for the area. They've kind of been there a long time, and you think, well, this home maybe doesn't have any significance. This one at least has some style. Do you make this look like that, or do you make these look like the mansard roof units, or is it really just a bulk and design that way rather than a material issue? Okay, in this block, you have a large parking area. This is 800 North again, campus up on the north, so this would be BYU parking lot. This little home is this home right here. And then you've got an elongated condo project right here that fits in. This is example one of the long ones that goes into the block. But again, you have an isolated home, and the question is, what type of development would we expect on this? Immediately to the south of that long unit, you have these two units that go along 700 North. And there's a parking garage right there that you can, oops, there are these two units, I'm sorry. Oh, there are three. Okay, I was looking at the wrong thing. There are three there, and here's the parking structure that comes down. So you've got three that are isolated, and seemingly you could fit that in, but again, it would be one of those, Is it good to hold to the 20 unit per acre density to fit in something here, or, do you look to allow the higher density through there? This last one is the other corner, and this shows, large home that's obviously two here that are, I think it's Piper or something like that. I can't remember the name of it. But again, this long building on the other side, which is at least 3 stories high there. So you can see, how do you redevelop that to fit into this area? And again, these are all less than 40,000 square feet. Okay, and then lastly, for these pictures, we've got one that's across from Joaquin Village. Joaquin Village is just here on the bottom of this block on 600 North. This one has units around it. You can see this mansard one here on the left with a parking structure underneath it. And this one's kind of a stacked townhome units that go along the east and the north. And they have access by going down and then parking underneath the units. So you go down and right in through here. And some owners have come in. This had an old home on it that was demolished about a year ago or so. And they're looking at what they could put in this project. They looked at some designs and the idea of how would it, fit in this area and still be parked and meet the parking requirements. There are still some issues on that of the parking and trying to make it fit. And, we don't know a way around that. Right now it's 0.7 parking spaces per bed. And so it would be, there's a real issue in that neighborhood on that parking ratio of whether it should be greater than that. This proposal has 10 units, so they would have to have, even though they've said, kind of couples in these units, there's always that part of how do you guarantee that occurs, and then plus there's still visitor parking, others that need to occur. So, there's still some issues with this, but some of the question they had is what would be, bulk density. The 10 units is only achievable if they got the 80 units per acre, because it's only about 8,000 square foot lot. And so if they did 20, they'd have to do something less, which, it's easy to say just do something less, but then again, you think, okay, now you've got a lesser building that's among taller buildings. Excuse me. But if the intent is to have a mix through the area, so you have variations of densities, heights, it's just an overall mix, and that's fine. If we're really looking for strong infill, though, then you would say, well, shouldn't we max the density on each of these sites if you can park it and if you can meet the other design standards?
Ross? Yeah,
Mr. Smith.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. If they were to build something like that, or 3-story, something that matched the neighboring buildings, they could, it seems like that building to the, I believe is the west, has underground parking. They could do something similar and meet the criteria for parking, right? So it could be in there. It's just we've got to make the space fill the zone, or the zone fill what the building would look like. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's a difficult through that whole area, because we have areas, we looked at one last week, where they basically paved their whole ground in the back other than the front yard. And they paved it and striped it for parking, but it's like one-way aisle parking that goes right into the building. The only way you can get out of it is to back totally out of the space. And you're going, that's not parking we would approve, but you're in kind of dilemma saying, well, we also want them to park on the site rather than off-site. And so it becomes one of this parking. Do we get so tied into exactly how it lays out versus are there alternatives you can look at to mass it or something else? But underground or structures, some of that was looked at, I think, with the parking study, where you would have something like what was done at the Wells Fargo building, where you'd almost have a community parking garage, maybe the city would manage, and then they would buy into that parking garage as they expanded units. One of the thoughts on that, it would get a little bit around the Joaquin Village, I don't want to call it a problem, but situation, where they actually have vacant parking spaces in their structure, but because they charge for those, people opt to park out on the street. And so it's an artificial kind of a measurement. There's maybe plenty of parking, but it doesn't show up because of the parking policies through there.
Right.
And I know Bill has worked on some of that on the parking policies.
Thank you, Mr. Maxfield and Mr. Smith. Mr. Pepperoni, you got a...
Yeah, let's just back up a little bit. So when the two zones were written, campus high density and campus mixed use, the idea was to incentivize assembling parcels. That's why you were able to go towards 80 units to the acre if you had an acre or more, 40,000 square feet or more. At the same time, we were trying to incentivize that. We were trying to disincentivize a development pattern that has happened there in the past. Does that have a laser on it? Where we've had cases where people have taken a parcel like this one and torn down the existing house, and they've built a building that fills everything except the setbacks, and its size and shape looks very much like a shoebox. We've seen a few of those get built in Joaquin, and so we knew we were trying to avoid that or discourage that. So, first of all, one policy decision is, are those assumptions correct? And by allowing a higher density on a smaller parcel, yeah, you can see how this has got development all around it, but are we going to end up getting projects that lead us into down the path that we were trying to avoid? And maybe one thing we should do is that, since we recommended this to be continued, when we wrote the Joaquin plan, the Joaquin Steering Committee was more in tune with design and aesthetics and really solid planning principles than I think any steering committee we've ever worked with. Maybe we should ask Bill Graff, the neighborhood chair, to assemble a group of people that can work with us on this issue, because I would certainly want their input on the thinking that we're going down, the lane we're going down, to make sure they're comfortable with it. One of the things they said during the Joaquin plan was, if you look at these historic homes like this, their attitude was they didn't really care so much that if it had 3 dwelling units in it or 6 dwelling units, if there were 6 students there or 12 students, that's not a typical response from citizens. They're very keyed into numbers of people there. Their thing wasn't over how many students are living there. Their thing was the aesthetic of it. How does it relate to the neighborhood? Is it in keeping with the fabric of the neighborhood? Those kinds of planning principles. So maybe we should get a subgroup of the Joaquin people involved in this discussion, because I would hate to have us start down a path that they're afraid of may lead to things that it's at odds with what they're trying to accomplish. But we'd love to have your input on any of these larger issues that we're discussing. It was suggested by a staff member that perhaps we have some kind of point system, that to achieve what we want, they have to go through some type of point system that relates to building scale and setback and materials and how it's parked and those kinds of things. Maybe we need to do something like that if we're going to try to allow people to do something on less than 40,000 square feet at a high density.
I think that'd be that portion about the point system might be a good one to have the neighborhood look at and address, because, as you said, that they are concerned not so much about density, but more about aesthetics, and that the developer could get credit or points on some arbitrary system for that. One question I had is the campus high density and the campus mixed use, because they're part of the Joaquin neighborhood, those zones were included and approved within that Joaquin neighborhood plan, correct?
Those zones were adopted.
In that, okay.
And north of 700 North, it was rezoned. to
Correct,
campus
for that
mixed-
area.
Right.
And to keep it up in that northern part of that neighborhood.
Now, the Joaquin plan allows for higher densities, not 80 units to the acre, but higher densities from 5th North on up.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes, Ms. Jensen, thank you.
And this goes back to what you mentioned earlier about parking, because I understand for multifamily having 0.7 per bed is kind of standard in a lot of places, but then you're operating within an existing established neighborhood, which does have on-street parking, but you are going to have units that have more cars.
We call it
And-
parking creep too.
Yeah.
And there's even an example right here where you start seeing cars that
Yeah.
come into there and other ones where the parking suddenly starts getting paved out to the sidewalk where
Yeah.
originally it wasn't.
And I was just wondering, it sounds like you're already thinking through what the parking ratio should be, and does that need to be adjusted in some way? But along with the parking regulations, maybe landscape, open space, permeable surface requirements along with that, so you don't end up with a totally paved lot except for maybe a little strip in the front. I mean, in my experience, parking is the tail that wags the dog.
Right.
If you can't park it, you can't build it.
Right.
Anybody could say, yeah, well, I could put 8 stories on this little site, and they probably could, and it might not look too bad if they designed it well, but they can't park it. And that's always going to be kind of the factor you have to back into to get the results you want on the ground.
So I remember the city council just asked me this exact question. So I looked at the last 6 to 8 projects. I can forward to you the email I sent him that has the results of this analysis. But the last 6 or 8 student housing projects that have been approved, they have ranged from about from less than 0.7 to over 0.1, over 1 space per bed. So a pretty wide swing in there. The recent complex we have gotten the most complaints on far and away has been Joaquin Village. And we've gotten so many complaints on that I think there's some hesitancy on the city council's part over that parking ratio, which is why the councilman asked me for some research. Anyway, I'll forward that out to you so you can see that. But I think that's certainly going to be an issue to the city council.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Jones.
I remember when I was a freshman at BYU, President Wilkinson, in his opening address, he talked about a number of subjects, and then he mentioned parking, and he says, we get a lot of complaints that there's no parking. Well, I remember at that time, I could park my car by the McKay building or by the Joseph Smith building. And if I had to walk 2 rows away from the building, that was a long walk, and we were spoiled. Anyway, he said, we're not going to provide more parking on campus. We are going to be parking less on campus. Eventually, this school will be a walking school. And I think his statement has proven to be true. As I observe the campus, they're not providing more parking. They haven't built a big parking garage or anything. Instead, they're making it more walking and shuttle buses. Okay, with that preamble, maybe the 0.7 figure is accurate, because if the students can't park on campus, then maybe there's not the pressure to bring a car to school. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's some pressure not to bring a car to school, or I think it's discouraged to bring a car to school just because of limited parking. What we have, though, is we still have, it seems like a high percentage of the students who still want to bring a car to Provo, though. Mm-hmm. So they got to store it someplace. That, and the other thing that we've never really been able to quantify very exactly is the amount of commuter traffic, probably even below 5th North up to campus. A lot of this on-street parking is commuter parking.
Yeah.
You still have these, the large BYU lots on this side, so they did add those.
But those are signed to BYU lots, and if you don't have a sticker for that lot, Ross can explain to you how that all works. You're probably going to park, look at all the parking on the street across the street from the lot.
I should mention that we do have text if you care to go through that, but we don't have to. Those are the ones that deal with the building form that are in the ordinance now and talk, about what the requirements are. If you look at them, they're really not extensive, though. And I think that's where this committee would come in, that we could flesh that out a lot more than they are presently.
Yeah, this text is not in our staff report, obviously, is it? No.
I think, for my part, it makes most sense to me where this deals with kind of a neighborhood master plan or a South Campus master plan and that kind of thing, to get into that kind of a committee where they can tear it apart before it comes here, and then tear it apart here. And then have we come out with something that's a workable resolution or solution.
So would you want to, I mean, obviously, we're going to continue it, but would it be possible to continue it until the city has had time to convene some meeting with
A neighborhood
some
committee.
group of the Joaquin Neighborhood Chair and other members of that neighborhood to provide some feedback and input to that? Because
My motion.
And you didn't, Mr. Maxfield didn't recommend continuing to a specific date. So we could continue it until
Right.
we've had or received that input and integrated that input into a second version of this report proposal, which may need to be continued perhaps maybe one more time, depending on.
I think that would be good if anyone on the planning commission, and we can email the members who aren't here tonight, if anyone on the planning commission would be interested in acting as a liaison to that neighborhood committee, that may be helpful,
Certainly.
but that's up to you.
Yeah, I think that would be also an excellent idea.
That's my motion.
So your motion is to continue the meeting, or continue the item, excuse me, until we've had received and integrated input from the Joaquin Neighborhood Chair, as well as members of the committee, and to have a member of the Planning Commission serve as a liaison with city staff and with those members of the neighborhood on this item. Is that correct?
Took the words right from my mouth,
Thank you.
from my thoughts.
From your brain. So there's a motion. Any discussion on that motion?
We need a
Seeing
second.
none, is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Jones. So all those in favor of continuing the item until city staff has had time to meet with the neighborhood chair, with a member of city staff and with a member of the planning commission, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed to not continuing the item is continued. Yes, Mr. Jones.
Now that the motion has been made and passed,
Yep.
I have a question on it.
Oh, well, sure.
Are we, would a member of the planning commission be permitted to attend this neighborhood meeting?
That is the plan. That is the goal, I think.
But I think there was some restriction on us making visits.
The quorum.
Yeah, I think one or two members to attend the committee meetings would be great. More than that, and it starts to,
Appear like a planning commission meeting.
right.
Well, it seems like one of the members got in trouble, not in trouble, but was questioned, was asked to desist from knocking on doors and taking a poll from the residents that surrounded a proposed development or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's true. In this case, we're talking about a planning commission member being a liaison to a committee that's going to be studying an issue that will come before the planning commission. I think that's completely acceptable.
Okay.
And in this case, you're kind of gathering information as to help form it rather than having a proposal and then taking the temperature of the neighborhood to see how to vote on something. It's
I
slightly
think
different.
I think the concern on the part of the mayor's office was was this particular member going out representing this city.
That would be problematic, yes. Because we'll have that representative from the city representing the city.
I just wanted to make sure. Sure if we do that we do
yeah,
it
I
properly
think-
and
yeah.
everything in order.
Thank you. We have one other administrative item. It is that time of the year to elect a new chair for the Planning Commission and a new vice chair. We have received from members of the Planning Commission 2 nominations for chair and 2 nominations for vice chair. I'll read these both and then we'll take a vote. The 2 nominations for chair are Deborah Jensen and Jamin Rowan. For vice chair, it is Deborah Jensen and Edward Jones. At this time, before we take a vote, we cannot receive input by email from members of the Planning Commission that are not here. Unfortunately, they have to be present according to the bylaws of the Planning Commission. They have to be present to vote. And in order for us to seat a new chair, we will have to have at least three votes in favor of one individual for the chair and 3 votes in favor of one individual for the vice chair. So because it's a public meeting, those in favor of voting for Mr. Jamin Rowan as chair, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those in favor of voting for Ms. Jensen for chair, please indicate by saying aye. The voting for chair seems to be unanimous, 4 votes in favor of Mr. Rowan and 0 votes in favor of Ms. Jensen. For vice chair, we have 2 nominations. We have Deborah Jones for vice chair again, and Mr.
You got to get our names.
I married you two, and I apologize to each of you. We have Deborah Jensen for vice chair and Edward Jones as the other candidate. Those in favor of Ms. Jensen for vice chair, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those in favor of Mr. Jones for vice chair, please indicate. Thank you. It appears as though the voting has been unanimous in favor of 4-0, or 4 votes in favor of Ms. Jensen and 0 votes in favor of Mr. Jones. Thus, it appears our new chair will be Mr. Rowan and the vice chair will be Ms. Jensen. Yes, Mr. Jones.
Just for the record, I think you should state that the nominations were received electronically.
Yes.
And that is permitted.
Yes, receiving the nominations was done electronically, and that is permitted according to the bylaws, but to vote, you must be present. Are there any other questions on that that administrative item? So we look forward to working with and serving with Mr. Rowan and Ms. Jensen as our Planning Commission Chair and Vice Chair respectively. Are there any other items to be addressed this evening? Seeing none, I'll look to a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved. We are adjourned, and we thank you for your participation. Have a wonderful evening.
But especially the Hispanic community in legal